This session promises to offer a profound exploration of the experiences of women during one of the darkest periods in history. Our panelists, each with their unique expertise, are here to shed light on an often overlooked aspect of this critical topic. So I'll first give you a couple of words about all our panelists, and then I will let the panelists speak. Before that, just some technicalities. So each panelist will have 15 minutes to present, and then we will have a joint discussion after all 3 papers are presented. So we have enough time to talk to everyone. So our first panelist is Dr. Beverley Chalmers. She is an internationally renowned academic with over 280 publications, 2 doctoral degrees, which brings her extensive research into childbirth in challenging social and political and religious settings. She is the author of the award-winning book, Birth, Sex, and Abuse, Women's Voices Under Nazi Rule, and she will present Manipulating Birth to Implement Genocide. Afterwards, we will hear from Dr. Sarah Valente, co-director of the Sandra Kahn Wasserman Jewish Studies Center at Baruch College, CUNY. She is an expert in Jewish studies, Holocaust memory, and the history of ideas. She is joined by Coral Katave, a medical student dedicated to promoting gender equality. Together, they will present Women in the Holocaust, the Abandonment of Medical Ethics. And finally, we have Angela Ford, a second-year PhD student in humanities at the University of Texas at Dallas. She specializes in women's history, sexual violence against women. Angela is also pursuing a graduate certificate in Holocaust, genocide, and human rights, focusing on women survivors of the Holocaust. She is a talented writer, known for her poetry, creative nonfiction, and a forthcoming memoir. Angela will present Sex for Life, Conditions that Necessitate Sexual Barter in the Holocaust. With this exceptional panel, we aim to deepen our understanding of the Holocaust's impact on women and the ethical challenges faced during this tumultuous period. So let's talk about a very important topic today, and I will give the floor to Beverley, who will, if I understood correctly, give us the video. Beverley, would you like to maybe give an introduction before the video?
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry that I can't be with you today. This was a long-term decision a while ago. I have family members who have health issues here that I need to be in Canada for. So it was not possible for me to join you. And I also wish to express my extreme solidarity with Israel and what the problems that are being faced at the time with Hamas up there. And I'm very pleased that you're able to continue with this, but we will do our best to keep our minds focused on this for today. No, there's nothing more I need to say. I'm assuming we will show the video, and I'd be very happy to answer questions afterwards. I'm very grateful that we could be on Zoom at least, because I did not think this was possible at the time that the recording was made.
Would you like to?
I will be talking today on manipulating birth to implement genocide. And this is primarily based on my book, Birth, Sex, and Abuse, Women's Voices Under Nazi Rule. We can think about the Holocaust as involving both direct and indirect forms of genocide. The ones we know a lot about are the more direct forms of genocide: gas chambers, starvation, torture, disease, and the intolerable conditions that were imposed on people regarded as unworthy of life, and primarily Jews. If we think back to the United Nations Genocide Convention of 1948, one of the criteria that was used to define a genocide was imposing measures that are intended to prevent births within a group. And this is very much what happened to women during the Holocaust, and especially Jewish women, but both Jewish and Aryan women. So manipulating reproductive and sexual life was a less direct method of implementing genocide. The Nazis had two objectives. One was to promote Aryan superiority, to create the master race, what I call geno-coercion. And the other one was eliminating the Jewish threat, life unworthy of life, or the genocide of the Jews as we know it. The more positive forms of eugenics were promoting Aryan birth, rewarding mothers for births who gave many births, especially those regarded as Aryan, preventing contraception, banning abortion, allowing for divorce if women were no longer willing or able to reproduce. Also, the Lebensborn program, where wives, especially of the SS, and unmarried mothers were encouraged to have babies, to give a child for the Führer, and also kidnapping Aryan children. In countries that they occupied, the Nazis would go door to door, find children that looked Aryan, and perhaps kidnap them and send them basically to the Lebensborn homes to be looked after and change their names so their origins could not really ever be traced. Negative eugenics was promoting life unworthy of life. And one of the means of this was sterilization by German doctors, and about 360,000 women were sterilized. These were Jews, criminals, work-shy people, prostitutes, the mental sex workers, as we now refer to them, mentally ill people, and those with inherited physical illnesses. Also, this was followed by the euthanasia program, where over 200,000 were killed. About up to 100,000 adult patients with mental illnesses were included in this program, about 5,000 children in institutions, 1,000 in special actions that were taken against Jews, and 20,000 concentration camp inmates. These programs of sterilization and euthanasia were not directed only at Jews, but at Germans who did not meet the criteria for being the so-called life unworthy of life, or life worthy of life. Eugenics, in fact, was very popular across Europe and North America, and the USA led the field at that time. This led eventually to the Wannsee Conference, which developed the final solution of the Jewish nation. And the list on the right shows the list of targeted people, and particularly Jews, that were to be eliminated through the Nazi genocide. And one of the primary means of this was through the gas chambers, where they could kill between 10 to 24,000 people every day. But first of all, the Jews were isolated into ghettos around the cities and towns where they lived across Germany and across the occupied countries where the Nazis invaded. And as the diary of Mary Berg writes, despite the abject poverty, despair, abnormality of life in the ghettos, flirting, romance, marriages still occurred, together with theatrical performances, concerts, education, and other semblances of normal life. In the ghettos, and life in the ghettos was harsh and difficult, and menstruation was affected. Starvation was a major concern, and that might well have been what led primarily to the loss of menstruation. Contraceptives became unavailable, and eventually in 1942, pregnancies were banned in many of the ghettos, especially in the Baltic countries. For example, in the Shauli ghetto, Jewish doctors were forced to implement the Nazi policy of preventing births. And the quote I take from the ruling of the delegation in 1942, in July, births are permitted in the ghetto only up until August the 15th, 1942. After this date, it is forbidden to give birth to Jewish children. It is permitted to interrupt the pregnancies by means of abortions. If women do not comply with this order, there is a danger that they will be executed together with their families. The ghetto doctors faced difficult ethical dilemmas, and we have the minutes of meetings that were held at that time amongst the ghetto doctors. And they faced the problem of, what do you do about late pregnancies? Can we terminate them? And what will happen to that baby if it lives? Who will kill the baby? Multiple abortions. Women sometimes have had multiple abortions, and they were afraid if they were forced to have another, they might never be able to give birth again. The other alternative was infanticide. Allow the baby to be born and then kill it. But who would do that? Would the doctor do it? Must the midwife do it? Would someone else be required to do it? Must the mother do it? They did not know how best to deal with this problem. And the other alternative was to take the baby and hide it, try to smuggle it out of the ghetto if possible, and bring it to safety with someone who might be willing to look after it. Some women refused to have abortions. Most did have them, and some doctors refused to perform an abortion for a woman. We have another example of in the Kovno ghetto in May 1942. One woman in late pregnancy was shot, and it led to a halachic dilemma, because we know that can a cesarean section be done, or could a cesarean section be done to try to save the baby, but that would desecrate the body, which is not allowed. In this particular case, the rabbinic ruling that was given at the time was that yes, one can try to save that baby, which they did do by performing a C-section. And the baby did live for a few days until the Nazis came to the hospital and searched the wards and found the baby and killed the mother, the baby as well. There were also roundups in the ghettos, in the towns and the villages. And during this process, women were again abused, especially pregnant women. But they were forced into having internal searches of their bodies, beating them. Some women were forced to give birth in public so that the Nazis could watch, or the Germans could watch and see how a baby was born. Others took babies and hit them against the walls to kill them. Some babies were used as target practice. Some babies were thrown from the maternity wards soon after birth onto the trucks below. Some pregnant women were eviscerated, and children and women were raped. In the camps, once the mothers were transported to there, both mothers and babies were targeted, and pregnant women were sent directly to the gas chambers. While they were in the camps, selections were held periodically to target women for extermination, and they'd certainly targeted women who had been pregnant but whose pregnancy was only beginning to show later on, and sent them for killing. They would also regard women who had large breasts or stretch marks on their abdomens as possibly pregnant and would send them to be killed as well, or even women who were simply overweight and might have looked a bit pregnant. In the camps, the Jewish doctors again faced difficult dilemmas. What should they do if women were pregnant? Should they try to abort the pregnancy to try and save the mother? Should they let the baby be born, if possible, if it was hidden and could be hidden until birth, and then commit infanticide? Or should they deliver the baby and allow it to be taken by the Nazis to be killed? Gisela Perl is a very famous woman, a doctor. She was a prisoner doctor in Auschwitz. And when she first arrived, the SS chiefs would call for pregnant women and offer them double bread rations, better living conditions, and say to them, come, we will help you, you're pregnant. And at first she encouraged them to step forwards in the hope that they would get better living conditions. Until one day she saw that a group of pregnant women who'd been taken off in this way and volunteered there to notify people about their pregnancy. And she wrote, they were surrounded by a group of SS men and women. They were beaten with clubs and whips, torn by dogs, dragged around by the hair, kicked in the stomach with heavy German boots. Then, when they collapsed, they were thrown into the crematory alive. From that point on, she would not help to identify pregnant women, and she would in fact abort multiple babies in order to save the mothers. Ruth Elias was one of the mothers who actually did give birth to a baby girl in Auschwitz. And Dr. Mengele, who was very much involved in some various kinds of research and experiments, ordered her to bind her breasts and not to feed her baby. He wanted to see how long it would take for a baby to die without its mother's milk. After about 8 days, a colleague, a friend, gave morphine to Ruth so that she could inject her baby and end its life. Another woman, Berta Reich, gave birth a few days later and immediately injected her baby with morphine. The baby was reported as a stillbirth. Both mothers were saved and later lived to give birth after the war. Infanticide was another option that faced doctors, and Dr. Lucy Adelsberger in Auschwitz saved poisons to kill newborns, and not to do so would be to condemn both the child and the mother to death. Doctors who were trained to preserve life became killers to help women survive. Another form of genocide that was conducted in the camps, in particular in multiple different camps, were medical experiments. One of them, by Dr. Steve, looked at the impact of impending murder on menstruation. He would tell women they were going to be murdered. These were usually imprisoned already. Women were imprisoned. He would tell them they were going to be murdered in a few days' time, and he will then watch to see what happened to their menstruation. Could such extreme stress influence menstruation? In terms of creating a master race, some of the experiments that were implemented were sterilization experiments using X-rays or drugs or chemicals injected into the uterus, surgical castration, especially of men, and hormone experiments injected into women to see what would happen and could they then remain fertile. Why kill women and children is one of the questions that emerges from all these bits of information about how women and children, and especially women, were targeted during pregnancy. And Heinrich Himmler writes or spoke, "We came to the question, what about the women and children? I have decided to find a clear solution here too. In fact, I did not regard myself as justified in exterminating men, let us say killing them or having them killed, while letting avengers in the shape of the children grow up. The difficult decision had to be taken to make this people disappear from the face of the earth." But at the same time as women were killed and murdered, sexual abuse took place, both of women and children. Women were sexually abused in ghettos, on the trains, in camps, by the Einsatzgruppen, by soldiers. And children became vulnerable to sexual abuse. They were not directly targeted for sexual abuse, but their situation left them vulnerable to such abuse. As family life disintegrated and their parents were no longer available to care for them, they were left alone and vulnerable. They were sexually abused when hidden with families or strangers. They were sexually abused by their protectors. Some who were on the Kindertransport were also abused by their rescuers. They were also abused on ghettos, in trains, in camps, by the Einsatzgruppen, by Wehrmacht soldiers, and by liberating soldiers. And I talk about these children who were sexually abused in my book, Betrayed, Child Sex Abuse in the Holocaust. The impact of rape, of pregnancy loss, of abortions, of sexual abuse, of the medical experiments, and of the horrific conditions that the women were forced to live in remained with those who survived. Many of the women, as you see on the right-hand side, are women in a DP camp who gave birth in the year following the end of the war. Had very difficult experiences relating to birth and relating to their loss or horrific experiences of abuse and so on. Pregnancy itself raised fears of anomalies. They were always afraid that the horrific conditions that they lived in under the camps would lead to their babies being born with abnormalities. Childbirth itself evoked memories of trauma, especially if they had been raped. Many of the women said they never enjoyed sex in the years after the war if they survived. Some wished that they had died or that they would die. And most remained silent about their abuse. It was very difficult and embarrassing for such women to talk about experiences they've had. It was a very different time when women were very modest and family life was much more restrained and restricted in terms of discussing intimate effects like menstruation or birthing. So many remained silent and would not ever even tell their partners about their experiences. How could this happen? We have explanations such as authoritarianism. They were simply obeying orders. How could the Nazis do this? Anti-Semitism. We judge the perpetrator's actions as being evil or cruel, requiring explanation or justification within our normal world. We see such things as cruel and as horrific, and how could they possibly do it? But the Nazis themselves, the SS and other German perpetrators, viewed such acts as normal and desirable. Their actions were, in their eyes, heroic, admired, praiseworthy. Their behavior was not incongruent with their normal selves. It was in keeping with their personal sense of integrity, and also was in keeping with the propaganda that Hitler and Goebbels had imposed on the entire German society for a decade or more, which imposed the idea on them that this was a valuable thing to do, to kill the Jews, to murder them, to eliminate them, these unwanted, unbearable people from the world, was actually a heroic act. As SS Major General Globocnik in Majdanek spoke in 1942, which was quite early on in the war, he said, "But gentlemen, if after us such a cowardly and rotten generation should arise that it does not understand our work, which is so good and so necessary, then, gentlemen, all National Socialism will have been for nothing. On the contrary, bronze plaques should be put up with the inscription that it was we who had the courage to achieve this gigantic task." And Hitler said, "Yes, my good Globocnik, that is the word. That is my opinion too." We found too that in the Nazi doctors' trial in Nuremberg in 1946-47, few of the doctors expressed remorse. Some wished to continue their work and asked for paper and pencil to record their findings so that they could be there for posterity. Some did publish their so-called research, and they, as a group, believed that they should be honored. We have to accept that some ideologies, such as Nazism, and some formalized religions, as opposed to spirituality, and some acts perpetrated within such often extremist frameworks, have throughout the ages frequently led to our moral, ethical, and spiritual impoverishment. Father Patrick Desbois, whom we know, whose writings we know well, writes, "An ideology can deceive minds to the point of annihilating all ethical reflexes and all recognition of the human in the other. I am convinced that there is only one race, a human race that shoots 2-year-old children." And I add, and may abuse them physically, emotionally, and sexually first. I give this talk and I write these books with respect for the women and the children who experienced reproductive and sexual abuse during and after the Holocaust. I believe we owe it to them to study this issue, to honor them, to understand their experiences, and to understand how the Nazis manipulated women's sexual and reproductive lives to achieve their goals. I am not available today to speak directly with you, sadly, but I am quite happy to engage with you in writing by email, and my email address is as follows: bevchalmers1@gmail.com. Please feel free to contact me. I would be very pleased and thrilled to be able to hear from you. And I would like to acknowledge with thanks to D Editions for their assistance with the presentation design. Thank you very much.
As you noticed, Beverley is here with us, so she will be able to join us in the Q&A. Thank you, Beverley, for those really important insights. So now we continue with the discussion about, as Beverley called it, ethical dilemmas, to what Dr. Valente and Coral Katave actually explicitly call abandonment of medical ethics. So I will leave the floor to Sarah and Coral.
Hello? Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Coral Katave. I am a third-year medical student at Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center, and I'm also a research fellow at Harvard Medical School. And today I will be presenting on women in the Holocaust, the abandonment of medical ethics, alongside my mentor, Dr. Sarah Valente.
Is it working? Can I see if it's on? Ne baš ne. There.
Her.
Just the Tivo. So killed. Switch.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry.
Perfect. I'll just say next slide.
Yes.
Okay. So it works. Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. So for today's presentation, I will go through the introduction, methods, content, implications, and then lessons learned. Millions of Jews suffered inhumane conditions orchestrated by the members of the Nazi Party during Hitler's Third Reich. Jewish women in particular suffered severe abuse of medical practices at the hands of the Nazi German physicians. Our research analyzes the first-hand narratives of women who experienced sterilization experiments at the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camps. Our study had three aims. One was to highlight the uniquely feminine experience of women during the Holocaust. The second was to evaluate the ethical implications of the healthcare values that were compromised during this time. And the third was to question the medical advancements that resulted from the horrific experiments on Jewish women. For our methods, we used the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive to collect personal testimonies of 7 women who experienced sterilization experiments in the Auschwitz-Birkenau camps. We selected a specific cohort of individual testimonies that best showcased the permanent physical and mental consequences of these experiments. We then conducted a systematic review of available literature to illustrate the historical and contextual background that led to the use of sterilization experiments in the Nazi concentration camps. We had 2 limitations to our study. One was the language barrier. There were few women who were speaking up about the experimentations that they endured. Even if they did, the language barrier prevented these testimonies from being studied in the American educational space. More information might have been available to us in our search. However, our choice of an American database excluded testimonies that were not conducted in English. So for the experiments, I will start with Karl Klauberg, who, prior to being recruited as a Nazi physician, actually spent most of his professional career completing progressive research on infertility. Klauberg performed injections of caustic substances, particularly formaldehyde, into the uterine, cervix, and fallopian tubes of women. This substance is capable of inducing chemical burns, and as a result of this treatment, the reproductive organs of the subject suffered severe inflammation. Complications were sepsis, peritonitis, hemorrhage, multiple organ failure, sterilization, and even death. Klauberg stated in a letter addressed to Himmler in June of 1943, "If the research that I'm carrying out continues to yield the sort of results that it has produced so far, one experienced physician will be able to carry out in the course of a single day the sterilization of hundreds or even thousands of women." The next Nazi physician that I will be speaking about is Horst Schumann, who was the pioneer of the X-ray radiation method of sterilization. If used in large enough doses, this radiation could cause extreme cell death and mutations. His goal was to find the optimal dosage that could cause complete destruction of female organs. Complications included severe burns, sores that were resistant to healing, cancer, and sterilization. So X-ray radiation induces what is called free radicals, Free radicals are uncharged molecules that have an unpaired valence electron. This typically means that they're very highly reactive and typically very damaging to the human body. Here you will see the equation of how free radicals are generated, and hydroxide, highlighted in red, is the most damaging. So how do hydroxide free radicals damage and harm the cell? They cause oxidation of DNA and oxidation of proteins. So as you can see here in this equation, oxygen is added to this bond, creating a highly reactive molecule that is damaging to the cell. Hydroxide free radicals also caused complete breaks of DNA, which causes cell mutations and cancer and even cell death. So I will now share 4 testimonies that stood out to me in this study. Herda Rokach, on the left, was a Jewish nurse born in 1929 in Frankfurt, Germany. She survived in hiding for a while in Belgium, and then she was moved and sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau. She mentions that the most difficult thing that she experienced in the camp was being put in the position as a nurse to inject other Jewish women. So as you can see, Jewish women were actually pitted against each other, and their sense of community was at risk. Sylvia Amar was a Greek Jewish immigrant born in 1915. She describes that after the liberation, she went to many fertility specialists and saw many doctors to see if she could eventually bear a child. And unfortunately, she underwent many procedures and she couldn't. Elizabeth Feldman was born to a family of 4 children in 1916 in Amsterdam. She eventually was sent to Auschwitz, and she mentions in her testimony that pieces of the womb were actually cut out. So her testimony is important because it showcases that the experiments were not confined to radiation and chemicals. They actually involved the surgical removal of female internal genitalia. So what are the implications? Nazi physicians were highly intelligent individuals with a mission to advance medicine and technology. We cannot attribute their actions to lack of intelligence or lack of education. They were very well educated and aware of the ethical implications of their actions. The Nazis even attempted to legitimize their systemic abuse of Jews, and this created the basis for the creation of the final solution. Medical experimentation was actually used as a guise for cruelty. So this creates a moral dilemma, right? Some medical findings from these experiments contributed to scientific knowledge, including the discovery of new diseases and new treatments. So this raises the question, should we utilize this knowledge derived from inhumane experiments? These are several diseases and conditions that were discovered in the Holocaust by Nazi physicians that performed medical experiments on Jews. As you can see here, Asperger's syndrome is one of them. It was named after Hans Asperger, who publicly legitimized race hygiene policies and actively cooperated with the child euthanasia program. Clara cells are another discovery that were made, and they are significant in pulmonary immunology. Smoking has been found to reduce the amount of Clara cells, and this knowledge is actually used in targeted interventions in the treatment of chronic smokers. So again, this raises the question, do we use this medical knowledge or do we leave it in the past? I think there are many answers to this question, but in my opinion, you can't get rid of knowledge, but you can reframe it. An example of reframing this knowledge is renaming diseases named after Nazi physicians. Wegener's granulomatosis is named after Friedrich Wegener, a Nazi German physician. It's an autoimmune disease, and that was renamed to granulomatosis with polyangiitis. Another example is Asperger's syndrome, which is now known as autism spectrum disorder. These are just a few examples of how we can reframe this knowledge so as not to credit the Nazi physicians for their crimes and discoveries. Medicine is built on the principles of compassion, care, and healing, and the Nazi regime completely corrupted these ideals for its own nefarious purposes. So this leaves us with the question, what can we do? The answer is to teach the next generation. As I mentioned before, I am a third-year medical student, and I have met countless medical students who have not heard of the Holocaust, and even more so, don't even know about the experimentation that occurred. These are future medical professionals, and it's vital to educate future medical professionals about this dark chapter in medical history. This will create an awareness of how Nazi medical professionals distorted the concept of treating the ill. And now I'd like to hand the talk over to Dr. Valente, who is a pioneer of Holocaust research in her own right. I studied under her mentorship in my last year of undergrad, and I produced this independent study under her, which inspired several other college and graduate level courses that resulted from our independent study.
Thank you all. I think this is a very difficult topic as is, and so I just want to start by saying that it's very difficult to be, sort of retouching on these topics and these ideas under the circumstances that are happening right now, a lot of the abandonment of any type of human ethics as is. So I just wanted to start with that. So just to give you a brief introduction about the work that Coral and I have done, taking you back to the fall of 2019, I had just defended my PhD thesis, which dealt with Holocaust survivors in Brazil, which is my area of study. And I had focused on the writings of men and women. I hadn't really thought about it from a gender perspective. I had just written about the memories in the memoirs of those who went to Brazil. And my first semester as a professor, one day I was in my office and here came a young student, Coral, asking, she was a pre-med student who wanted to learn more about the Holocaust and specifically about women's experience of the Holocaust. And here I was, a recent grad who had studied at a Holocaust studies facility that has existed since the early 80s. And I myself had never taken a course specifically focused on the women's history. And so it was from this interaction very early in my teaching career that I started thinking about how can I now design a course about this topic and teach students about it. And very quickly what became apparent to me was that not only when teaching about women's experience in the Holocaust, it is not only about women's experience in the Holocaust itself, but it is also in a way teaching the history of women scholars about the Holocaust. So it becomes a kind of dual exercise in trying to sort of tell this history from both these dual perspectives. And what we have found, what I have found, at least in my experience, now I have taught this course, every semester since then, with the exception of this past year, and I'm set to teach it again in the spring, is that there is great interest, especially the new generation. There's a great interest in this. I've taught more than 50 students who have written many papers about it. So some of the topics, for example, thinking about how gendered conscious chronology can help us understand something about the Third Reich, discussing the specific contributions of women who were writing history, such as Rachel Auerbach, Cecilia Slapek during the Holocaust itself, discussing things such as the mechanisms of survival that women specifically created in Ravensbrück, for example, and then thinking about very difficult questions such as the one that Coral has chosen to focus on, which is the role of the medical experiments and the abandonment of ethics. So this is what I would like to share with you. It's always a very difficult course to teach, but I think that makes it even more important for us, all of us who are teaching these courses, who are inspiring the next generation of students to be engaged with these topics. So it is my honor to be here sort of alongside with Coral, just to listen to her project once again. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Valente.
Sarah, Carol, we're sadly over time. So we're over time, so if you want to.
Oh, okay, I'll end my talk for sure. I want to end the presentation with this quote from Elie Wiesel in an interview with Carol Rittner, who actually spoke today and is considered one of the founding mothers of the studies of women's experience during the Holocaust. What hurts the victim most is not the cruelty of the oppressor, but the silence of the bystander. We need to continue giving a voice to Jewish women that were silenced, and this includes educating others, publishing research, writing books, and hosting conferences, and most importantly, never forget. I think the words never forget are used very frequently with the Holocaust, and I think it's important to reflect on what exactly it is that we're trying to remember, right? The experimentations performed on women are not usually the first thing that you think about when you think about the Holocaust, right? And it's important to actively think of this and remember this, as Jewish women are so very often targeted. This is now, given the current situation in Israel, more important than ever. Women, as we speak, are being abused in the war. So when we say never forget, please make sure to never forget the women who have suffered and continue to suffer under the hands of anti-Semites. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Coral. Thank you, Sarah. And now we move on to our final presenter for today, Angela Ford. She will give a talk entitled Sex for Life, Conditions that Necessitate Sexual Barter in the Holocaust. Angela.
Thank you. I don't have any slides, so. Okay, my paper is titled Sex for Life. Can you hear me? No. Sex for Life, Conditions that Necessitated Sexual Barter in the Holocaust. In an article on... We don't hear you. You can't hear me? Is that better? No? Not better. Okay. Or I'll just hold it. Is that better? Okay. In an article on the history of prostitution in the Holocaust, author Anna Haviva discusses the story of a survivor, Alice Haberland, who traded sex for food. A Rabbi Leobeck arrived in Theresienstadt, and his biographer, Leonard Baker, mentioned an encounter with Haberland. He writes of her as if she were spoiled, did things she regretted, and used the rabbi to attain comforts she missed before arriving at the ghetto. Haberland was selling sex to keep her family members alive, and once she quit, several of them died. After liberation, she never spoke about her experiences. Haviva states that Haberland's story raises questions about the shamefulness of sexual barter and the suggestion that her actions required forgiveness. In her efforts to investigate the nature of stigmatization of sexual barter in the Holocaust, Haviva points out that sex work as labor in ordinary circumstances maintains that some similarities as far as who has or would have chosen this lifestyle. But she also acknowledges that no matter how much researchers seek out information of that time, two facts remain. Sex work viewed as labor inherently differs from sex work in life and death circumstances. And the stories that would have given researchers insight into the conditions that necessitated sexual barter will never be heard, since many of the storytellers were silenced by stigma and shame and have already died. Some topics are so difficult to discuss that they have been relegated to the category of taboo. One problem with taboo subjects is they are often used by perpetrators to simultaneously abuse and silence victims. Perpetrators count on society to at best frown at their mention, and at worst re-victimize those who dare to speak out. Two major topics that are notoriously difficult to discuss are the Holocaust and sexual abuse. What happens when they are combined and a third component is introduced, sexual economy? To many, this inclusion justifies the opinion that since the sex was voluntary, the victim was complicit and is the one to blame for any harm incurred. In this paper, I look at the current literature surrounding the use of sexual barter by women in the Holocaust. We are left with an abundance of survivor testimonies that mention controversial activities undertaken to survive unspeakable conditions. Those who spoke out did so knowing that the world may not approve of their actions, yet they risked judgment anyway so their story would be told. In this paper, I use the terms sexual violence, sexual barter, and rape, even though the focus is on sexual barter. While the primary difference in these terms is the inclusion or exclusion of agency, I mention all three since they apply to sex as a means of survival. Since researchers rely on survivor testimony, and those testimonies are often fraught with shame, I use the terms to include stories that may contain messages that attempt to circumvent stigma. This paper will begin with a discussion of existing scholarship on the topic, primarily as it relates to shame and stigma. Most scholarship is relatively new since discussions of sexuality were not commonplace in the decades immediately following the Holocaust. The paper will then look at survivor testimonies through a 21st century lens that better understands, even if only slightly, the many facets of sexual trauma survival. This paper will address the topic of sexual abuse in the Holocaust as seen through the experiences of women who use sexual barter for survival. My goal is to destigmatize the use of sexual barter and put into perspective its use as a survival tactic that it is. Much of the literature begins by acknowledging the relative lack of information on sexual barter or violence. Discussions of sexuality with Holocaust survivors have largely been silenced by shame on the part of the victim and stigmatization by society. Poet Wisława Szymborska wrote, "History rounds off skeletons to zero," which author Nomi Levincon explains is easier than counting sexual abuse victims, since skeletons are more tangible and visible. It is nearly impossible, especially this long after the war, to determine how many people were subjected to sexual acts against their will. Levincon goes on to say that the living women who were raped hide for they fear the stigma that is likely to cling to them if they reveal what was done to them. Given the many forms of silencing that existed, we must take seriously those who dared to speak, since they provide the only evidence that exists of sexual abuse during the war. When the war was over and men were brought to trial to answer for their crimes, of which rape was only sometimes considered when ancillary to other crimes, the justice system did not jump at the opportunity to convict perpetrators. In some cases, rape was not even considered a crime, but more of a transgression of the rules of engagement. The lack of justice from the courts only served to embolden perpetrators and legitimize their actions. Meanwhile, survivors who want to tell their story and are left to suffer alone and in silence. A survivor's memories and pain belong not only to the individual, but to the collective community. By speaking of their traumatic experience, the survivor forces the community to acknowledge the trauma towards it as well. Levincon says, speaking turns a painful personal trauma into a mortal blow to national pride. She goes on to explain how shame was used as a social weapon to keep victims from speaking out about their experiences. Many women would rather risk suffering in silence than bring disgrace to themselves, their family, and their name. Women were often told that what happened to them was their fault, especially in cases of barter when women were perceived to have a choice. Since they could choose whether or not to participate in barter, they were not considered victims, but instead the enemy within. Their communities felt a deep sense of betrayal by women who chose to have sexual contact with the enemy rather than kill themselves to protect their own honor and that of their nation. In this sense, women who faced sexually violent circumstances had only two options: death or disgrace. Holocaust researcher Katja Gusarov emphasizes that with sexual barter, the term voluntary is problematic since it implies women had a choice that was not influenced by her circumstances as a prisoner in the war. She goes on to emphasize that women did have agency, and even in the most restricted circumstances, women could make decisions. This concept can be difficult to grasp. After all, it seems sex must have been one or the other, but this is not a binary matter. In the Holocaust setting, a woman could have had sex that she did not want, and it still would not be considered sexual violence because she chose to do it to stay alive. In these cases, sex should not be viewed from a moralistic standpoint, but rather as a simple and readily available alternative to death. Leading trauma expert Bessel van der Kolk writes about shame in his book, The Body Keeps the Score. He says that after a person has experienced something as horrible as trauma, it can be nearly impossible to trust oneself or others ever again. These immovable barriers may be one reason why trauma survivors attempt to rewrite their histories. By denying an event occurred the way it did, a person can lead themselves and others to believe that there is nothing to be ashamed of, and therefore no reason for barriers in relationships to exist. He says, "It's hard enough to face the suffering that has been inflicted by others, but deep down, many traumatized people are even more haunted by the shame they feel about what they themselves did or did not do under the circumstances. They despise themselves for how terrified, dependent, excited, or enraged they felt." In her article on forced prostitution in the Warsaw Ghetto, Katarzyna Persson says that victims were not only ashamed to speak of sexually violent events, but this shame was reinforced by researchers who could not, or perhaps for various reasons did not want to, ask directly about sexual abuse. Of all the atrocities that occurred in the Holocaust, sexual abuse is sometimes still too difficult even for researchers. As a result, a Holocaust survivor, as with any survivor of sexual abuse, receives the message that their sexual abuse stories are too much for society to acknowledge, too shameful to attach themselves to, or that their experience was simply insignificant. These perceptions further marginalized and silenced women. Holocaust historian Anna Hakova states in an article on the sexual economy of the Theresienstadt ghetto that sexual barter is an umbrella concept under which prostitution falls. But because of the deeply stigmatizing meaning that prostitution carries, the term sexual barter is preferable. She goes on to say that sexual barter always contains an element of choice, something that rape does not have. Even if the rapist rewards the victim after the assault, she was not offered a choice, and it is therefore not barter. In her research, she has relied mostly on survivor testimony, which also lacks many details of their experiences. She says when survivors mention pragmatic motives in relationships or sexual encounters, they are typically describing other people's actions, seldom their own. There are no first-person testimonies from women who engaged in instrumental sex. In another article, Hakova defines sexual barter as an exchange of sex or affection for resources or protection, and a means by which Holocaust victims sought to ensure their survival, as well as an expression of agency. She reiterates that even violent sexual encounters could be considered barter instead of rape if the encounter contained an element of agency. In the article, Hakova attempts to explain some of the more difficult stories of survival that occurred with marginalized prisoners. If prisoner or post-war society deemed a group deviant or asocial, those stories of survival were judged harshly. Their stories were considered unworthy of being told and were overshadowed by those more morally pure. By dismissing stories of sexual barter, history is deprived of important lessons about power hierarchies and alternative means of human survival. Stigma was not only handed down by readers of narratives after the war, but by survivors themselves while still in the camps. In the book, Different Voices, Women in the Holocaust, authors Rittner and Roth include a story by Gisela Perl, a Hungarian gynecologist and prisoner working in Auschwitz. Perl tells of being shocked by the practice of sexual barter in the camps, sexual encounters usually taking place in the fetid atmosphere of the latrine. Perl says her pride, her integrity as a woman, revolted against the very idea, until she herself contracted a venereal disease. In her position as a doctor, she saw that the items bartered for, food, clothing, and shoes, were items that kept women alive. Keeping women alive was her job, and she realized that through sexual barter, these women were doing their part in keeping themselves out of the crematorium. Perl says, "I began to understand, to forgive." Perhaps stories of sexual barter are not cleaned up out of shame, but rather out of the mind's inability to fully process and communicate what occurred. For many of the young women, relations in the camp may have been their very first sexual experiences. In any context, first encounters can be misconstrued as their own choice and are only discovered to be abuse much later when the person has more life experiences from which to draw wisdom. In The Body Keeps the Score, van der Kolk briefly looks at the psychological effect of trauma, specifically on Holocaust survivors. In doing so, he looks to Holocaust scholar Lawrence Langer's book, Holocaust Testimonies, The Ruins of Memory, in which one survivor states, "If you were not there, it's difficult to describe and say how it was. How men function under such stress is one thing, and then how you communicate and express that to somebody who never knew that such a degree of brutality exists seems like a fantasy." Van der Kolk says that each patient demands that we suspend our sense of what is normal and accept that we are dealing with a dual reality, the reality of a relatively secure and predictable present that lives side by side with a ruinous and ever-present past. Survivors risk their entire experiences, identity, and assimilation back into society if their testimonies are challenged. As I've tried to show in this paper, stories of sexual barter must be carefully presented to protect all aspects of the survivor's future, including the processing of their own trauma. By revisiting survivor testimony alongside scholarly literature on sexual trauma survival and fictional representations, my hope is that further study of women survivor memoirs will reveal new information about sexual abuse in the Holocaust and how compassion can open our collective eyes to help abuse victims rather than shun them in favor of their abusers. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Angela. Thank you all four presenters for these very complex, insightful, and thought-provoking, I think, for everyone, presentations. Before I open up the floor, I'd just like to sort of see that there are the connecting dots between all three presentations. So Beverley's, who gave us a very great insight into the complexity of the problem, the levels on which it occurred, and then the medical aspects that they lack, I think properly named abandonment of ethics, that was really pointed in Coral's and Sarah's talk, and then Angela discussing the questions of silencing and trauma. Just so you know, here in Serbia, medical students actually don't consider ethics as a key course for them to study, and in some cases it's actually not even a mandatory course. So if we're talking about future generations of doctors, the question of ethics and its positioning is very, very skeptical. There are doctors working in centers for victims of sexual violence who told me as a researcher that they're more interested in trainings in laparoscopy than they are of questions of the social, which is more for psychologists. So there are questions that we can learn from all of your talks to reflect about current situations today. So I thank you for that. I'm going to open up the floor now for questions. So maybe we could take 3 questions and then do another round afterwards. Beverley, Beverley, are you with us?
Yes, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
A question, but also an observation about Dr. Valente and Koval presentation about the barriers by the woman in the witnesses. I think that there is another barrier that can we add. Is connected about a history connected to Sardinia about I will talk tomorrow, and this is the hiding of the personal information and the destruction of the informations by the witness themselves after they wrote about that. One example very clear is the history of Laura Geiringer. Laura Geiringer is a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau. She died in 1951 in Italy, and very, very probably she was a victim of the experiments because in her journal we know that there are pages broken by herself, and 2 years after her death, Herman Langbein wrote to Laura to ask them to witness in against Klauberg in the first Auschwitz trial. So perhaps we are the certain that she was a victim of the experiments, but she wrote that and she destroyed this information. Is another barrier that we have about that, and I think that we can add this.
Can we pull 2 more questions and then?
Yes, of course. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. My question is for Coral. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this. I'm at UMass Amherst, by the way, so I'm right down the road from you. But my question primarily has to do with the use of medical knowledges from Klauberg and Schumann after the war, insofar as Schumann was no gynecologist by any means, right? He headed Grafeneck, the euthanasia center, but they had already known from the late 19-teens that X-rays could sterilize people. So that was well acknowledged in medical studies, and so I wasn't sure if there was something from that was being used in medical knowledges today. And for Klauberg, we know from the women who did survive that 57 of them went on to bear children. So he was actually really bad at his job. So I'm not really sure what knowledge could be used from those. So as for the sterilizations, right, Klauberg was very instrumental in terms of his fertility work. His infertility work he was actually very poor at, but I'm wondering if there are any specific medical knowledges that you're referencing that still exist or are being used in relation to the sterilization experiments.
Medical practice, are you
oh no, because I had seen that because you had mentioned how we use these knowledges, even the eponyms, and how these things live on. So I'm wondering the connection between that and the Block 10 sterilization experiments, since they were put together, if there was something still alive from that, so to say.
Okay, should we take one more question, or should we?
Yes, please, so we can then have we'll do it 3 and then.
I have a question for Beverley. My name is Paul Kuttner. I'm from American University. I recently interviewed Dr. Ephraim Zuroff of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and he was going after a Lithuanian woman who might be living in Canada, identified as the student Klamaita in documents for throwing babies against the wall. I don't know if you've been following that case, but do you think if this person is in fact the right person that they believe that they've identified, do you think that justice for this person, now that these things are being discussed more and more, do you think that will look different than what we saw in the Nuremberg trials?
Can have Coral answer first, and then Beverley, and then we'll do another round of questions.
Yes.
So the first question about the limitations, I just want to touch on that briefly. Can you hear me? Okay, sorry. So I said I want to touch on the first question about the limitations, which is a really great point that you're bringing up. And I think, one of the things that Crow and I always talk about is we think about, obviously, we're operating in the United States, we're thinking about, okay, what are American students learning about this history? And then obviously there's, unlike here where all of you or most of you are bilingual, trilingual, 4 languages. In the US, we have by and large a population of students who are monolingual. They only speak English, right? So we were really thinking about that aspect of what is available to our broad student audience when they're doing this kind of research. So the language is the first thing. And then we also know, that from the testimonies in the Shoah Foundation, the USC Shoah Foundation, obviously the women who are coming forward and telling their stories have found an environment in which they could share, right? And we see this happening more and more. For example, many of you are probably familiar with the work of Father Desbois, Holocaust by the Bullets, where now they go into these tiny little villages, and because there is an open space to discuss these types of abuses, all of a sudden, 88-year-old women are telling their stories for the first time ever. So I think it also has to do a lot with this environment, right? The environment that is created by researchers can facilitate an openness into sort of putting aside a lot of these limitations. But thank you so much for sharing.
I think to answer the second question, if I understood correctly, when I mentioned the diseases and the conditions that resulted from experimentation, it wasn't necessarily sterilization that was the only one, right? And so I think it's important to focus on experimentation as a whole. And while sterilization and those methods were used continuously for years, and they might not be used anymore due to ethical reasons, and it's just wrong, right? Experimentation in general opened the door to many diseases. Reiter syndrome, Asperger's syndrome, now known as autism spectrum disorder, Wagner's granulomatosis, all of these diseases resulted from research during the Holocaust. There's even a very prominent anatomy textbook that resulted from, just experimenting on human bodies and using humans as corpses. And so having access to that many bodies resulted in one of the most influential and widely used anatomy books in medical education. And so that raises another question: should we use this book given everything that led up to its creation, right? So I think it's important to mention all of the experiments as a whole, even though sterilization isn't used anymore. So.
Beverley?
Yes, thank you. Can I just add a little, before I answer that question that was asked, can I add a little to that first question, in that we need to keep the time frame in perspective when we are talking about or thinking about how women expressed and talked about sexuality and their experiences. At the times 50, 60, 80 years ago were very, very different in terms of modesty amongst women. And taboo, sexual activity was absolutely taboo. Women were frowned about indulging in it outside of marriage. And even in marriage, you didn't talk about it. It was a very private event, and nor did society allow for it. So it was a very much, one needs to keep the time perspective as to when women are now beginning to reveal their stories. The other side of that is that it's not only the women who are reluctant to express their sexual stories, it's the interviewers. If you look at the Fortunoff Library interviews, they were asked with express intention of making records available for family. So women would have been very reluctant to tell their intimate, abusive stories, knowing that their children or their grandchildren were going to possibly listen to these testimonies. So we didn't ask the questions properly. And even later with the Shoah Foundation, we didn't directly ask those questions, although even we did a little more. So it may not be only the women's reluctance to speak about sexual abuse, as well as the time in which they talked about the sexual abuse. We are more free today than we were 50 years ago. But it could be also that the interviewers didn't ask about it for the same embarrassing questions. I have often given talks about these subjects: abuse, betrayal, child sex abuse. And I'm often asked, why do we need to talk about this? This is taboo. It's not necessary, and it's degrading to the women. I don't agree with that. And I do believe that we need to speak about it, not to degrade the women, but to honor them. We can certainly respect privacy and remove names and dates and places, which is unlike historical research, but in order to protect their privacy. But I think the events and the incidences of what happened need to be exposed so that we can honor the women and actually recognize what they had to endure. So sorry to go to a digression, but that was the one question. The other question, if I remembered correctly, you asked about whether someone who today has been recognized as having thrown babies against the wall should be treated in any particular way in the law situation. I'm not following the particular case at the moment in Canada, although I'm going to look it up. But I do believe that people who have committed such crimes, and there were multiple reports of people taking babies and hitting them against trees or against trucks or against walls, and killing them in the process of rounding up people, Jewish people, for the camps or for the Einsatzgruppen, that we need to treat them with the severity of that crime that they have committed. It is the most horrific thing, and I don't believe if they're 80 years old or 90 years old, they should be let off scot-free. They need to be taken to trial, and they need to be faced with what they did. And punished in whatever way it is. I don't think that age is an issue that can excuse it. And I afraid to even think about it in Israel at the moment. We saw horrific images, and we've heard stories, but horrific images of a young girl who was possibly raped, and who's been dragged around the streets of Gaza on the back of a truck, bleeding, for all to see. And I don't believe that that crime is any less and you can't equate them, but it's a crime that ought to be charged today, as I think we would all agree, if we can. But just because it happened 80 years ago and the child's body was smashed against a wall, doesn't mean we should ignore it or forgive it because it happened a long time ago. It's a horrific crime, and we need to confront the people who have implemented such actions. I'm not sure if that was the question you're asking, but it's certainly the one I've answered. So I hope that gets somewhere to where you were getting at. Thank you.
Another round of questions?
I wanted to ditto what you just said about the interviews having a lack of information about the sexual abuse. I used the interviews from the Shoah Foundation, and it was very clear that the interviewer, once the person began the interview, we began to speak about sexual abuse, they changed the subject. And so if there's any opportunity for researchers today to look at the interviews, I forget the numbers right now of how many there are, wherever they mention anything having to do with sex, sexual abuse, rape, to, if any of the women are still alive, to try to re-interview those women specifically about that issue. Now, one of the things we need to understand is that rape as a weapon in Holocaust and genocide was a criminal act in all the genocides except the Holocaust, because the Germans were not allowed to have any sexual relations with Jewish women because of Rassenschande. And so that's something that we need to keep in mind, that now at all the Hague tribunals, I don't know, it's very recent that now rape is considered a weapon in the genocide and in the trials that are taking place, and that did not happen with the trials during the Holocaust. And when you keep talking about the Barter, Sister Carol Rittner, John Roth edited a book on rape as a weapon in Holocaust and genocide, and I wrote one of the papers there, and basically talking about the sexual abuse from the perpetrator side, and that rape and that Barter, I saw Barter as a rape, really. So I think that we need to think about that in terms of that, not just in terms of the victims, but rather in terms of the perpetrator and the victim. And just one other thing, which is that the Jewish women did not speak about it, because we have to remember, like you were saying, in terms of the difference of, the mores of the time, any woman who had experienced sexual experiences before she was married, talking about a lot of, religious women, even the non-religious women, she became damaged goods. And so even in some of the interviews, you see that women who, in fact, you knew they were raped, and they kept saying, I wasn't raped, I wasn't raped, I wasn't raped. And indeed, that they're trying to cover it up, because then it would have been difficult to have gotten a husband after the war.
So we'll pull 3 more questions, considering our time. So
yeah, my question actually connects quite well, because there's this term agency that's more and more in focus now of research, and sometimes I get the impression that it's stretched too much. I think it's really important to look at agency, but I would also agree we should be careful of stressing a voluntary aspect here, because for example, Lawrence Langer, he wrote about choices, and my impression, even if they use it as a strategy for survival, it was not voluntary. We need to see it in the context of power abuse and power relations. So I would also like, highlight this aspect more of that it was really not a choice. If you have to choose between like being murdered or eventually, or like trying to stay alive in whatever way. So that was my comment for the terminology. And then I have a question for Coral. I was quite interested because, like Sarah, you said it actually initiated your education at university, that a student came up to you, and now I'm more interested in Coral's perspective. Why did you ask your professor if she knows more about it, and what's your perspective?
Coral, if we can just 2 brief more questions, so we have about 10 more minutes for answers.
All right, so I will be fast. I have a question for Beverley. I was really curious when you mentioned dilemmas related to Jewish religious law, halacha. And I wonder about where, like, in geographically, where you found the most sources, which doesn't mean that only those, let's say, in those ghettos, they dealt with those kind of questions, but it can tell us something about the types of questions that Jews were asking their religious leaders. And then I also had a question for Coral. We have these turns in Holocaust studies. There are different ones, right? So I wonder if you see your research as part of a medical turn in Holocaust studies, and if so, to what extent? And then for Angela, my question is about age, and to what role did age play in sexual barter?
One more question so that we are sure that we've answered it. And then I'll let the floor.
Thank you. There is no question. I wanted to refer to Coral words. You spoke about reframing the terms of the researches and everything. My son 3 years ago got sick with ANCA vasculitis, which is a Wegener disease. And this is how they call it in the hospital in Israel. And when I understood that Wegener was a Nazi doctor, I was amazed that they are still using that. And since then, they are not using that anymore in Israel. They use the ANCA vasculitis and not Wegener. And the other thing is that we are going to publish the great research about the hunger in the Warsaw Ghetto next year in Hebrew. And we know that many women, girls, and kids were abused just to get some food. And it's not in the research, of course, but we know that it's part of what they have been suffered from.
All right. Coral, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you so much for sharing that. To answer the first question, I think the thing that inspired me to reach out to Dr. Valente is I used to go to undergrad at University of Texas at Dallas. And to those of you who may not know, the school has a very large Arab population, and myself as a Jewish woman, alongside many other Jewish students, faced racial slurs and harassment on campus. And so I was feeling very vulnerable as a Jewish woman on campus, and I happened to walk by the Holocaust Center the same day that everything was going on. I tried to talk to my dean, and nothing was done about the situation. And I felt inspired to just go in and sort of ask the question, like, how could I develop my identity as a Jewish woman, pursuing medicine, and empower myself in this struggle that I'm facing at school. And I was lucky enough to find a mentor who supported me in my educational journey and personally as well. So I'm very lucky. to answer the second question about the medical turn in Holocaust studies, I think there's so much to be done in that area. From the standpoint of physicians, I think a lot of non-physicians have done a lot of work in this field, but I think physicians now need to take a stand and to provide their medical expertise and outlook on this specific issue. As you mentioned before, there aren't ethics classes usually in medical education, which is astounding to me because the mind is so important. And ethics is so important in medicine. And so I think this is a greater question to raise to larger organizations such as the American Medical Association and similar organizations in other countries to actually evaluate the implications of ethics and how important it is to the long-term education of physicians.
Thank you. Beverley, would you care to go next?
Yes, if I can again comment on a couple of things. Just what, in response to what Carol has just said, there is an expert on this, Sabine Hildebrandt. I don't know if you know of her work, but she would certainly be worth exploring and asking about in terms of the use of the medical experiments and especially the use of the anatomy books, terms that were created using victims of the Nazi Holocaust in the camps. And she's done huge amounts of work on whether one should actually use that information and use the documentation of the medical experiments. She's worth speaking to. The other thing that's worth in terms of medical ethics is looking up that the whole medical ethics that emerged in medicine emerged from the Nuremberg, from the Holocaust. And that is a huge history of what has happened to that over the last 50 years that still guide us to an extent, but they've been watered down in many, many ways. So that's another historical aspect that follows up the medical research in the Holocaust. That would be super for you to have a look at. One other comment I wanted to make was someone commented on rape and Rassenschande. The Rassenschande laws by no means, they certainly did forbid sexual contact with Jewish women, but they weren't all that effective. Jewish women were certainly abused sexually in many, many cases. I think what the Rassenschande laws did was encourage the abuser, the perpetrator, to kill the woman so she couldn't talk about it afterwards. And that would be more likely the impact of sexual abuse of Jewish women as a result of the Rassenschande laws than really protecting women from being abused or raped. So there's just another aspect, and I have no data to support that other than that that's what I know happened many, many times from incidents that have been reported. I don't have quantities of how many. Many of the women are dead and cannot speak about it, obviously. All right, the other question was, which more directly addressed to me, was on halakha and my sources. I was fortunate to be guided on this by Miriam Gillis-Karlbach, the late Miriam Gillis-Karlbach, who was directed me to look into this. And I did come across, through her, with her assistance, a number of references to the many dilemmas that were faced by women in these kinds of incidents. For example, the women who were used as prostitutes in the camps and were maybe tattooed, a prostitute for the women for the armies of Hitler, or women who didn't know if the other ethical dilemma, women who didn't know if their husbands survived and they were separated and then may have wanted to remarry afterwards, could they? And in these cases, they did seek rabbinic rulings. And many of them are available on many of these difficult issues faced by women. I don't have an exact reference in my mind, but if you email me, I will gladly send you the resources that I used. They are all referred to in my book on birth, sex, and abuse, women's voices under Nazi rule. So if you have that, the references are in there. Otherwise, I will personally look them up for you and provide you with the sources that I was able to find.
Thank you, Beverley. Angela, finally, just a refresher, so there were questions about what is choice and how can it be framed, and the question of age was directly to you.
Okay, so to answer hopefully both of the questions at the same time, in the full paper that I did, I used women's. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I used women's memoirs, and I used films. I think there are a few films that I looked at and some documentaries. So I used a wide range of sources, not just stuff that I mentioned here. To answer the age question, because of the sources that I used, the children did not come into the picture too much. And I mean, I know that it happened, but I didn't actually focus on the children. It was mostly just women, things that happened as they were adults. To address the agency, it wasn't really a question, but to address that, in looking at the films and the books and all the other sources, there is a wider range. I didn't want to make any assumptions because there were some cases there was love and there were actual legitimate relationships, and I didn't feel right at this point, especially in this paper, of assuming that any love that anybody who claimed was love relationship. I didn't want to say, well, that's not true. That's, this is what it was. So I kind of left things open for just kind of instead of speculating on what these types of relationships were. I understand that there is, there are the circumstances that they weren't going to be all, like normal everyday life, but I didn't want to do any speculation. So I understand that there were, conditions that they didn't necessarily have the same agency that we do in these times. I don't know if that helped at all, or.
It was more a comment on framing it as a choice, and like to trade in sex for survival. And I was arguing, I don't think it was a real choice in a condition where you didn't have real choices. So I was more opting for like using terms like choices in this case. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the conditions were definitely different, but some women did have choices to make, and as difficult as they were. So I didn't, basically what I was looking at is the women who did choose to do things, whether, there's a vast spectrum of these decisions that they were making, is that the women who did make decisions to do things, even to do it and not kill themselves. I want to take away that shame, any kind of shame that would be connected to that.
Of course. I wanted to add one comment to the first question that the professor made about the testimonies and this idea. Today we talk about the survivors and we honor their memories by telling all that happened, but I think it is very important for us to think about the immediate after-war period. These were young women who were looking for a prospect of a new life, building a new life. And how do you do that? By having all of this history come out, right? So there was actually a lot of sort of prejudice about a survivor. How did you survive, right? There was this kind of almost something denigrating to the survivor. You must have survived because you did something, right? So that would be one thing. But then also what we find, even in some of the testimonies that Crow and I looked into, is this kind of projection, right? So a woman will tell the story that she knows of a friend who was raped. She saw something happen and she'll go on to describe it. So obviously we cannot attribute that to being her own experience, but it happens a lot in these testimonies, right? So I think we can sort of put these things also together. Again, there's no way to accurately make a statement that, well, because she is personifying to somebody else, that was her experience. But as scholars, I think it points towards the difficulty that is and was for these women to ever tell their stories.
Well, this is our time. I want to once again thank our presenters for these very thought-provoking talks that opened, I think, a lot of conversations that will carry on in other panels as well. I want to thank you again on behalf of the Institute for being here with us and the conference. So we have a break and we'll carry on.
Thank you.